They told them to fear the fences, but no one ever prepared them for what it meant when there were none. The truck moved slowly along a dirt road that stretched wider than anything Anna Keller had seen in months, maybe years, its tires pressing soft tracks into pale American soil as the late afternoon sun hung low and heavy, casting long shadows that seemed to reach toward the vehicle like silent questions, and inside, no one spoke, not because they had nothing to say, but because every word felt dangerous when uncertainty filled the air this thick, when every mile forward unraveled something they had believed was certain. And Anna sat near the edge of the wooden bench, her hands folded neatly in her lap, posture straight despite the exhaustion in her bones, her eyes fixed not on the guards, not on the other women, but on the shifting light slipping through the slats of the truck's side, measuring distance, counting seconds, observing everything the way she had been trained to do in field hospitals where survival often depended on noticing what others ignored, and yet this felt different. Because there were no signs of urgency here, no raised voices, no commands barked across the wind, only the steady hum of the engine and the occasional crunch of gravel beneath rubber, and that silence pressed harder than any threat ever could, because it left too much space for thought, for doubt, for the quiet unraveling of expectation, and when the truck finally slowed, then stopped, the engine cutting off with a soft mechanical sigh, no one moved at first, as if movement itself required permission that had not yet been given, and Anna felt it then, the shift, subtle but unmistakable, like the moment before a storm that never arrives, and one of the women across from her whispered under her breath, barely audible, "This is it," but there was no gate ahead, no barbed wire glinting in the sun, no watchtowers cutting sharp lines against the sky, only open land stretching outward in every direction, a few wooden structures set back at a distance, and something else, something harder to define, an absence so complete it felt intentional, and Anna narrowed her eyes slightly, not in fear, but in calculation, because absence, she knew, was never accidental, especially not in war, and the back of the truck creaked as it opened, a soldier stepping into view, his uniform neat but not rigid, his posture relaxed in a way that didn't match the stories they had been told, and for a moment he said nothing, just looked at them, not through them, not past them, but at them. And that alone was enough to unsettle the balance Anna had carefully maintained, and then, finally, in a voice that carried no edge, no command sharpened by urgency, he spoke, "Step down." Slowly, and the words hung there, simple, almost ordinary, and yet nothing about this felt ordinary, not the tone, not the stillness, not the way no one rushed forward to enforce compliance, and Anna waited, just a fraction longer than the others, watching, measuring, because this was the moment everything was supposed to confirm what they had been told, and instead, it did the opposite, because when the first woman stepped down onto the ground and nothing happened, no shout, no correction, no tightening of control, the silence deepened, and Anna followed, her boots touching the dirt, solid, real, and she lifted her gaze slowly, scanning the horizon again, searching for the lines that defined captivity, for the structure that separated prisoner from world. But there was nothing there, no fence, no boundary, only open space and the quiet understanding that something fundamental had just been removed, though no one had yet explained what would replace it. No one told them where to stand, so they stood where they landed, a loose line forming not by order but by instinct, each woman leaving just enough space between herself and the next as if distance could still offer protection, and Anna noticed it immediately, the lack of correction, the absence of a shouted command to straighten the line or close the gaps, and she adjusted her posture slightly, not to comply, but to observe how long it would take for someone to notice, but no one did. The soldier who had spoken earlier stepped aside, not turning his back, but not watching them closely either, as if their presence did not require constant supervision. And that unsettled her more than any guard tower ever could, because control, real control, was supposed to be visible, structured, reinforced at every moment, and here it felt optional, and the wind moved lightly across the open ground, carrying the faint scent of pine and something else, something clean, untouched by the weight of confinement, and one of the younger women shifted her feet, glancing toward the tree line about 50 yards away, her body leaning forward just slightly before pulling back again, as if testing the idea of movement without permission, and Anna followed her gaze, tracing the invisible distance, measuring it the way she would measure a patient's pulse, steady, deliberate, searching for irregularity, but there was none no markers, no boundaries, nothing to indicate where they were supposed to stop, and yet none of them moved, not fully, not beyond a step or two, because something deeper held them in place, something learned long before this moment, and then the soldier spoke again, not loudly, just enough to reach them. "You will be staying in those barracks," he said, nodding toward a row of simple wooden buildings set back across the field, his tone even, almost conversational, and still no one moved immediately, the pause stretching, thick with unspoken calculation, until one woman finally stepped forward, slow, cautious, her boots pressing into the dirt as if expecting resistance that never came, and Anna watched closely, not the movement itself, but the reaction around it, the guards, the soldier, the space between action and consequence, and there was nothing, no interruption, no warning, just the continuation of stillness, and that was when Anna felt it, not fear, not relief, but something unfamiliar, something she could not name yet, a shift in the rules she had relied on to understand the world, because if there was no visible boundary, then the boundary had to exist somewhere else, and she turned her head slightly. Studying the soldier again, the way he stood, the way he did not rush them, did not rush anything, and she realized he was watching, just not in the way she expected, not guarding their movement, but observing their choices, and that distinction settled heavily in her mind, because choice was not something they had been allowed to have, not for a very long time, and as she finally stepped forward herself, her pace steady, her gaze level, she understood that whatever this place was, it did not rely on walls to hold them, and that made it more complex than any prison she had imagined. The barracks stood quiet under the fading light, their wooden walls pale against the open land, simple structures without ornament or intimidation, and as the women approached, their steps slowed again, not because they were ordered to, but because each movement now carried a different kind of weight, the uncertainty no longer tied to punishment, but to interpretation, and Anna kept her eyes forward, though she registered everything. The spacing between buildings, the lack of visible locks on the doors, the absence of guards positioned at entry points, details that did not align with any system she had known, and when the first woman reached the nearest barrack and hesitated at the threshold, her hand hovering just inches from the door, no one rushed her, no voice urged her forward, and finally she pushed it open herself, slowly, as if expecting resistance from something unseen, but the door moved easily, revealing a clean interior, rows of narrow beds, folded blankets placed with quiet precision, and windows, real windows, uncovered, open to the outside air, and that detail alone caused a ripple of stillness among the group, because windows were not meant to be open in places designed to hold people in, and Anna stepped inside a moment later, her boots soft against the wooden floor, her eyes moving from one detail to the next, the beds evenly spaced, the absence of bars, the quiet presence of order without force, and she paused beside one of the bunks, placing her hand lightly against the blanket, not to test it, but to confirm its reality, and it was real, simple, clean, untouched, and behind her, more women entered, their movements cautious but no longer rigid, the formation dissolving into something less defined, less controlled, and still no one told them where to stand, where to sit, or what to do next, and that silence stretched again, not empty, but filled with expectation that no longer came from outside, and Anna turned slightly toward the open doorway, where the soldier still stood at a distance, not watching directly, but present enough to be aware, and she noticed the way he leaned just slightly against the frame, not as a guard enforcing boundaries, but as someone allowing space to settle on its own, and one of the women finally spoke, her voice low, uncertain, "Are we assigned beds?" she asked, not to anyone specific, but into the room itself, and for a moment, there was no answer, until the soldier replied from outside, his tone unchanged, "You may choose," and the words landed differently than any command they had ever received, because choice, even in something as small as a bed, carried a weight they were not prepared for, and Anna felt it then, that subtle shift becoming clearer, the realization that structure still existed here, but it was not imposed in the way she expected, it was offered, and accepting it required something from them, something internal, something voluntary, and she moved toward a bed near the window, not because it was better, but because she wanted to see, to understand the outside without obstruction, and as she set her small belongings down, she glanced once more through the open frame, across the wide stretch of land where no fence marked the edge, and she understood that whatever held them here was not Something she could touch or see, but something she would have to learn to recognize within herself. Evening came without announcement, no bell, no whistle, no signal that marked the transition from day to night, only the gradual dimming of light as the sun lowered beyond the tree line, casting long shadows that stretched across the open ground and slipped quietly through the windows of the barracks, and inside, the women moved with a cautious uncertainty, their actions slower now, less mechanical, as if each decision required thought rather than obedience, and Anna sat on the edge of her bed. Her hands resting lightly on her knees, her posture unchanged, but her attention sharpened, listening not for orders, but for patterns, for any indication that structure would eventually reveal itself in a more familiar form, but it did not. The silence remained, broken only by the soft creak of wooden floors and the quiet movements of others settling into spaces they had chosen but did not yet fully trust, and across the room, one woman stood near the window, her fingers brushing the frame as if testing its reality, pushing it slightly, then pulling it back, repeating the motion as though expecting it to behave differently the second time, and no one stopped her, no one corrected her, and that lack of interruption created a tension that lingered in the air, because without restriction, every action became a question, and every question demanded an answer that no one was giving them, and then footsteps approached outside, measured, unhurried, and the same soldier appeared briefly in the doorway, not entering fully, just enough to be seen, and he spoke in the same calm tone as before, "Mess hall is open. You will find food there," and again, no command followed, no instruction on how to line up or when to go, just information offered and left for them to act upon, and he stepped away before anyone responded, his presence fading as quietly as it had arrived, and for a moment, no one moved, the words settling slowly, because even something as simple as eating now required a decision, and Anna rose first, not quickly, not with urgency, but with intention, and she moved toward the door, her steps steady, her gaze forward, and after a brief hesitation, others followed, not in formation, not in order, but in a loose, shifting group that reflected something closer to choice than control, and outside, the air had cooled slightly, carrying the faint sound of insects and distant movement from beyond the immediate space, and the path to the mess hall was visible but not enforced, a worn line in the ground that suggested routine without demanding it, and Anna walked along it, aware of the space around her, the openness that remained unchanged, and as they approached the building, she noticed something else. The door was already open, light spilling out into the dimming evening, and inside, there were no guards directing them, only a few soldiers moving quietly behind a serving counter, placing trays, adjusting items, their movements efficient but not watchful, and when the first woman stepped forward, there was no pause, no inspection, just a tray handed to her, simple, direct, and she moved aside without being told, and Anna stepped forward next, meeting the soldier's eyes for a brief moment as he handed her a plate, his expression neutral, not cold, not warm, simply present, and she accepted it with both hands, a habit formed long before this place, and as she turned away, she realized that nothing here was forcing them to behave with dignity, and yet, without realizing it, they already were, and that realization settled deeper than anything she had felt since arriving, because it suggested that whatever held them here was not built from wood or wire, but from something far less visible and far more difficult to resist. The room filled slowly, not with noise, but with presence, the quiet sound of trays touching wooden tables, the soft scrape of chairs being moved without instruction, and Anna chose a seat near the edge, not isolated, but not centered either, a position that allowed her to see without being seen too closely, and she placed the tray in front of her with deliberate care, her eyes scanning the contents not with hunger, but with analysis. Bread. Real bread, not dark, dense substitutes, a portion of meat, vegetables that still held their color, and a cup filled with something warm, and she paused, not because she doubted it, but because the simplicity of it did not match the expectations she had carried across an ocean, and around her, others reacted in smaller ways, a slight hesitation before sitting, a glance exchanged between two women as if confirming that this was not some temporary illusion, and then they began to eat. Slowly at first, each movement controlled, measured, as though waiting for something to interrupt, but nothing did, no one rushed them, no one counted bites or monitored pace, and the soldiers behind the counter moved on to their own tasks, no longer focused on the prisoners once the food had been served. And that absence of attention shifted the weight of the moment, because without observation, their actions belonged entirely to them, and Anna lifted a piece of bread, breaking it carefully, the texture soft beneath her fingers, and she brought it to her mouth, tasting it not just for flavor, but for what it represented, something given without condition, and she chewed slowly, her gaze drifting briefly across the room, noticing how posture had changed, shoulders less rigid, movements less synchronized, not because discipline had faded, but because it was no longer required in the same way, and then something small happened, so small it might have gone unnoticed anywhere else. A cup slipped from a woman's hand, falling to the floor with a dull sound, the liquid spreading across the wood, and for a moment, everything paused, not from shock, but from expectation. Because this was the kind of moment that usually triggered correction, a voice, a reprimand, some form of consequence. But none came. Instead, the woman froze, her eyes lowering instinctively, her body tightening as if preparing for something that did not arrive, and then a soldier stepped forward, not quickly, not urgently, just steadily, and he picked up the cup, placing it back on the table, his movements precise, unhurried, and without a word, he returned to the counter, leaving the woman to sit there, uncertain, her hands still, her breathing shallow, and Anna watched this closely, more closely than anything else so far, because this was the moment that revealed more than any structure or lack of it. There had been no correction, no acknowledgement of error beyond the action itself, and yet the situation had been resolved, and the woman slowly reached for the cup again, her hands steadier this time, not because she had been told to continue, but because she chose to, and Anna felt that same unfamiliar shift deepen, the realization that behavior here was not being enforced from the outside, but guided by something internal, something that required awareness rather than fear. And as she continued to eat, each bite measured, each movement deliberate, she understood that the absence of fences was only the surface of something far more complex, because what truly defined this place was not what had been removed, but what had quietly been expected to remain. Darkness settled gently over the camp, not as something imposed, but as something natural, the sky deepening into a quiet blue that stretched endlessly above the open land, and the absence of artificial light beyond the barracks made the stars appear sharper, more present, as if the world itself had stepped closer now that nothing stood in its way. And Anna lay on her bed without fully reclining, her back straight against the thin pillow, her hands resting lightly at her sides, her eyes open, fixed on the window where the night moved freely without obstruction, and she listened, not for orders, but for disturbance, for any signal that would redefine the structure she was still trying to understand. But there was none, only the distant hum of insects, the occasional shift of wood as the building settled, and the soft breathing of others around her, rhythms slowly falling out of sync with one another, no longer bound by the uniformity that had once defined their nights. And that difference unsettled her more than noise ever could, because silence here did not carry tension, it carried permission, and she turned her head slightly, watching the faint outline of one of the other women sitting near the edge of her bed, not sleeping, not moving, simply existing in a space that no longer demanded constant readiness. And across the room, another woman stood by the window again, her hand resting against the frame, her gaze fixed outward, and this time, she did not pull back. Immediately, she remained there, still, as if testing not the window, but herself, and Anna followed her line of sight, beyond the barracks, beyond the open ground, toward the tree line that marked no official boundary, only a natural edge where visibility softened into shadow. And for a moment, a quiet thought surfaced, simple, direct: what would happen if someone kept walking, not quickly, not with urgency, just continued forward past where they had all instinctively stopped earlier? And the question lingered, not as temptation, but as observation. Because the answer was no longer obvious, and that uncertainty shifted the meaning of everything, because if nothing physically prevented them from leaving, then staying required something else entirely, something internal, something chosen. And Anna felt the weight of that realization settle slowly, not overwhelming, but persistent, and she closed her eyes briefly, not to sleep, but to organize the thoughts that no longer aligned with the structures she had known, because discipline had always been external, reinforced through visibility, through correction, through consequence, but here, it existed without those elements, and that made it more precise, not less, because it depended on awareness rather than force. And she opened her eyes again, the stars still visible through the window, unchanged, constant, and she understood then, not completely, but enough to recognize the shift, that this place was not removing control, it was redefining it, moving it from something imposed onto something expected. And as the night deepened and the quiet settled further into the walls, into the spaces between breaths and thoughts, Anna remained still, not out of obligation, but out of choice, and that distinction, subtle as it was, marked the first moment she realized that the absence of barriers did not mean the absence of structure, it meant that the structure had simply moved somewhere she could not yet see, but was already beginning to feel. Morning arrived without a signal, no horn, no shouted command, only a gradual shift in light as the sky softened from black to pale gray, then to a quiet blue that spread evenly across the open horizon, and Anna was already awake before the first full line of sunlight reached the window, her body adjusting not to routine, but to awareness, and she sat up slowly, her movements controlled, her gaze moving instinctively toward the open frame where the outside world remained unchanged, the same wide stretch of land, the same distant tree line, no new structures, no sudden appearance of boundaries overnight, and that consistency unsettled her more than change would have, because it confirmed that what she had seen the day before was not temporary, not an oversight, but intentional, and around her, the others began to stir, not in unison, not rising at the same moment, but gradually, each woman waking at her own pace, some sitting upright immediately, others remaining still for a few seconds longer, as if waiting for something that did not come, and the absence of a wake-up command created a quiet hesitation that lingered in the air, because without instruction, even standing required a decision, and one by one, they made it. Slowly, carefully, and Anna stood, smoothing the fabric of her uniform without urgency, her movements precise but no longer rigid, and she stepped toward the window again, placing her hand lightly against the frame, feeling the wood, solid, unchanged, and she looked out, her eyes narrowing slightly as she focused on the edge of the visible land, the place where instinct had told them to stop the day before, and for a moment, nothing moved, until she saw it, a single figure stepping beyond that invisible line, one of the women, the same one who had lingered by the window the night before, her posture steady, her pace measured, not running, not hesitating, just walking forward across the open ground, and Anna watched closely, every detail registering, the distance growing with each step, 20 yards, 30, then more, and still no reaction, no guard stepping forward, no voice calling her back. And the rest of the camp seemed to hold its breath without knowing why, because even those who had not noticed directly felt the shift in the air, the quiet tension of a boundary being tested, and Anna did not move, she did not call out, she simply observed, because this was the moment that would define everything, not the presence of control, but its response to absence, and the woman continued, reaching a point where the ground sloped slightly downward toward the trees, her figure smaller now, less defined, and still, nothing interrupted her, until finally, she stopped, not because she was forced to, but because she chose to, and she stood there for a few seconds, looking outward, then slowly turned around, retracing her steps back toward the barracks, her pace unchanged, her posture steady, and when she returned, no one spoke, no one questioned her, and no one needed to, because the answer had already been given, not through words, but through action, and Anna felt the shift settle fully into place, the understanding no longer incomplete, because what had been invisible was now clear, there were no fences because they were not required, the boundary existed within the choice to respect it, and as she stepped away from the window, turning back into the room where the others were now moving more freely, more naturally, she realized that the system here did not rely on preventing escape, it relied on something far more precise, something that could not be built, only recognized, and once seen, could not easily be ignored. The morning unfolded without urgency, no signal marking the beginning of duty, no voice assigning roles, and yet movement began to take shape, quiet and uncoordinated at first, then gradually settling into something that resembled rhythm, though no one had defined it, and Anna stepped outside the barracks with the others, the cool air still holding the softness of early light, and she noticed immediately how different their movements felt now, less cautious, less restrained by expectation, and yet not careless, not unstructured, but guided by something internal that had not existed the day before, and across the open ground, a small group of soldiers stood near a wooden table, tools laid out in an orderly arrangement, not guarded, not hidden, simply present, and one of them, the same corporal from before, glanced toward the women briefly before returning to his task, sanding the edge of a plank with slow, even strokes, as if their presence did not require adjustment, and that lack of reaction created a new kind of tension, because without resistance, interaction had to be chosen, and one of the women approached first, not boldly, but with measured steps, stopping a few feet away from the table, her posture straight, her hands at her sides, waiting, not for permission exactly, but for acknowledgement, and the corporal looked up then, meeting her gaze for a brief moment, not assessing, not evaluating, simply recognizing. And he nodded once, a small gesture, almost easy to miss, but clear enough to be understood, and she stepped closer, her movement steady now, and began to assist without instruction, picking up a second piece of wood, aligning it beside the first, her actions careful, deliberate, and no words were exchanged, not because they were unnecessary, but because they had not yet been earned, and Anna watched this from a short distance, her eyes following the interaction, noting the balance, the absence of authority imposed through voice or posture, and yet the structure remained, defined not by command, but by mutual understanding, and she stepped forward as well, not toward the table directly, but toward the edge of the activity, observing the spacing, the rhythm of movement, the way each person adjusted without being told, and she saw it clearly now, the pattern that had been forming since their arrival, not a system of control, but a system of expectation, one that required awareness rather than compliance, and as she reached the edge of the group, the corporal handed her a pair of gloves without looking directly at her, the gesture simple, unspoken, and she accepted them with both hands, a quiet acknowledgement passing between them without the need for words, and she began to work, her movements precise, aligning materials, adjusting angles, her focus narrowing into the task, and around her. The others did the same, not directed, not corrected, but guided by the space itself, and time passed without measurement, the sun rising higher, the light shifting across the ground, and still, no one imposed structure, and yet it held, steady, consistent, and Anna understood now that what defined this place was not the absence of barriers, but the presence of something far more demanding, something that required each person to carry a part of the structure within themselves, and as she worked, her movements no longer shaped by fear or anticipation, but by intention, she realized that this system did not remove control, it redistributed it, placing it quietly into the hands of those who were expected to recognize it, and for the first time since arriving, she did not question where the boundary was, because she already knew. The day settled into a quiet rhythm that no one had announced and no one questioned, the sound of measured work blending with the natural movement of the wind across open land, and as the sun began its slow descent, casting long lines of gold across the ground, Anna stepped back from the table, removing the gloves with the same care she had used to put them on, her movements deliberate, her breathing steady, and she glanced outward again, toward the same distant tree line that had once represented uncertainty, and now stood simply as part of the landscape, unchanged, unthreatening, and she realized that her attention no longer searched for boundaries, because it no longer needed to, and around her, the others moved with a similar quiet confidence, not relaxed in the sense of forgetting where they were, but adjusted, aligned with something that had replaced the constant tension of expectation, and the corporal gathered the tools without counting them aloud, without checking each item against a list, trusting that what had been used would be returned, and it was, each piece placed back in its position without instruction, and Anna noticed this, the way responsibility had been accepted without being assigned, and she understood that this was the final piece, the part that could not be imposed, only recognized, and as they began to walk back toward the barracks, no formation emerged, no order dictated their steps, and yet they moved together, not by command, but by shared awareness of direction, and the light continued to soften, the sky shifting toward evening once more, and the open space between structures felt different now, not empty, but defined by the choices made within it, and Anna slowed slightly as she reached the doorway, her hand resting briefly against the wooden frame, the same frame she had tested the night before, and she paused, not from hesitation, but from recognition, because nothing about the physical structure had changed, and yet everything about her understanding of it had, and she stepped inside, her gaze moving across the room where the beds remained in their simple alignment, the windows still open, the air still moving freely, and she sat down, her posture steady, her hands resting lightly in her lap, and for a moment, she allowed herself to be still without analyzing, without measuring, simply present in a space that no longer required constant interpretation, and outside, the last light of the day faded gradually, the horizon dimming into shadow, and the stars beginning to appear again, quiet, constant, unchanged, and Anna looked toward the window one last time, her eyes no longer searching, but understanding, because what had once felt incomplete had now revealed itself fully, and she realized that the absence of fences had never meant the absence of control. It had revealed something far more precise, something that required no reinforcement, no visible boundary, only recognition, and as she closed her eyes, her breathing even, her body at rest, the thought settled clearly. Without resistance, without doubt, they had not been left unguarded, they had been entrusted with something far more difficult to carry, and they had accepted it without being told, because in the end, no structure holds stronger than the one a person chooses to maintain, and no boundary stands clearer than the one a person decides not to cross.